We've been wrestling with the big question of actually doing something. But how we decide who's us and who's them, that's not just abstract philosophy. It's deeply wired into our brains, and sometimes, tragically, it leads us down dark paths. Our minds are wired to make distinctions, often based on perceived kinship. Think about it evolutionarily. Recognizing your kin was crucial for survival and reproduction. We saw examples from pheromones in insects to imprinting in birds, and even among primates like baboons, where a male's behavior can be predicted by his paternity likelihood. By the time we get to humans, this process is largely cognitive. We think our way through who belongs to our group. And here's the kicker. Because it's cognitive, it's malleable. It means we can be manipulated, pushed to see certain people as closer kin, pseudo-kinship, or conversely, so different they barely count as human, pseudo-speciation. So, how do you manipulate someone into seeing another human as less than human? Well, there are plenty of psychological tricks, but the most potent weapon, the one ideologues and propagandists have known for ages, targets a specific part of our brain, the insula. This little region is heavily involved in processing disgust, empathy, and moral judgments. If you want to make people feel that an other is fundamentally repulsive, subhuman, almost vermin-like, you hit their insula. And what's the most effective way to trigger that response? Metaphor. Using vivid, shocking metaphors to dehumanize the enemy makes the psychological leap to violence feel almost inevitable. It's not just words, it's a neurological manipulation. Let's ground this in a harrowing real-world example, Rwanda in 1994. For many Westerners, this was the first time they heard of Rwanda. A tiny country incredibly crowded. Historically, it was home to hunter-gatherers, who were eventually displaced by agricultural Hutus and pastoral Tutsis. Were they originally distinct groups, or just different social strata that evolved into ethnic identities? The debate continues, but what's clear is that they developed a fierce us versus them dynamic. Traditionally, the minority Tutsi herders held power over the Hutu farmers, a classic power dynamic seen across Africa. Then came colonialism. Both German and Belgian rulers played the divide and conquer game, exploiting and inflaming these tribal animosities for their own benefit. After independence in 1962, the tables turned. Hutu dominance led to discrimination, persecution, and violence against Tutsis, driving many into exile. These refugee populations formed rebel groups, seeking safe haven back in Rwanda. Predictably, this fueled more anti-Tuts sentiment among Hutus, leading to further massacres. There's a grim irony here. Given the uncertainty about whether they were ever truly separate peoples, it often became impossible to tell Hutus from Tutsis visually. Ethnic identity cards became essential. By 1994, the situation was tense. President Juvenal Habyarimana, a Hutu military man who had seized power years earlier, was under pressure from Tutsi rebels. Under duress, he signed a peace agreement involving power sharing. Now this move was seen as a betrayal by the growing Hutu power extremist faction within his own government. On April 6, 1994, Habyarimana's plane was shot down as it approached Kigali. Who pulled the trigger? Was it Tutsi rebels trying to frame Hutus, or Hutu power elements within the military aiming to eliminate Habyarimana and immediately blame the Tutsis? The truth remains murky, but the outcome was swift and brutal. Within 24 hours, moderate Hutus in the government were killed. Hutu militants took control, officially blamed the Tutsis for the assassination, and called upon all Hutus to take revenge. And tragically, most complied. This compliance unleashed a genocide that lasted roughly 100 days. It wasn't just about targeting Tutsis, it was a systematic attempt to eliminate anyone associated with them or anyone who resisted. This included Hutus married to Tutsis, those who tried to protect Tutsis, and those who refused to participate in the killings. The numbers are staggering. Between 750,000 and 1 million Tutsis, roughly 75% of the entire population, were murdered. Additionally, around 100,000 Hutus were also killed. That translates to about 1 in every 7 Rwandans losing their life. To put that in perspective, the killing rate was 5 times higher than during the Nazi Holocaust. And amidst this unimaginable horror, the international community, particularly the West, largely turned a blind eye. Now, let's be clear about how this happened. This wasn't about tanks rolling through cities or trains filled with victims heading to concentration camps. There was no Zyklon B gas. No bureaucratic machinery of evil like the Holocaust. Instead, the violence was raw, intimate, and devastatingly low-tech. It was neighbors bludgeoning neighbors, friends killing friends, spouses attacking spouses. Tutsis were beaten to death with sticks. then often subjected to horrific sexual violence before being finished off with machetes. Sanctuaries like churches were tragically turned into death traps and burned. The scale was relentless, an average of 10,000 people killed per day. Perhaps the single most shocking act of betrayal occurred in the town of Nyanje. The local Catholic priest Athanase Saromba, a Hutu, took in between 1,500 and 2,000 Tutsis, many of whom were his own parishioners, offering them sanctuary. And then he led the Hutu militia that ultimately killed every single one of them inside his church. Rivers ran red, literally. So how could such atrocities unfold so rapidly? Several factors converged. First, there was a deeply ingrained culture of unquestioning obedience to authority, a trait cultivated under decades of dictatorship. Second, Hutu militants had been systematically distributing machetes to the general population for months beforehand. Third, the state-controlled media, primarily radio, was relentless in its propaganda. It broadcast messages claiming the invading Tutsi rebels intended to exterminate all Hutus and portrayed Hutu neighbors as a fifth column ready to join the attack. But perhaps the most critical factor was the ceaseless dehumanization. The propaganda constantly referred to Tutsis, using the term cockroaches. Imagine the psychological impact of hearing your neighbors, your colleagues, your friends described as pests to be stamped out. The message became chillingly simple: stamp out the cockroaches. They're stealing your husbands, raping your wives, planning to kill your children. Save yourselves, kill the cockroaches. With their insular courtesies firing on all cylinders, fueled by fear and hatred, and armed with machetes and propaganda, most Hutus crossed the line into violence. This brings us back to the power of dehumanization. When we label someone as something other than human, a pest, a cancer, a transitional species, something inherently revolting, we fundamentally change how we perceive them. We strip away their humanity, their shared moral status, and the psychological cost of harming them diminishes dramatically. Propaganda thrives on this. It uses symbols of disgust, metaphors of disease and decay, to create a visceral revulsion towards the designated enemy. The goal is to short-circuit rational thought, to engage the emotional and instinctual centers like the insula, and to make horrific acts seem almost necessary or justified. In Rwanda, when the insula was inflamed by constant dehumanizing rhetoric, combined with the readily available tools of violence and the pervasive fear-mongering from the radio, the tragic result was almost preordained. Most Hutus caught in this storm complied with the call for genocide. These images, while difficult to look at, serve as stark reminders of the aftermath. The first shows human remains, bones and skulls, displayed in a way that speaks to the sheer scale of loss and the reduction of individuals to mere objects. It's a visual echo of the dehumanization process we discussed, turning people into statistics, into specimens. It forces us to confront the reality of what happened when hatred and propaganda meet violence. The second image focuses specifically on skulls, arranged neatly, almost clinically. This presentation can evoke different feelings, perhaps a sense of finality, the undeniable evidence of lives extinguished. Each skull represents a story, a family torn apart. Seeing them arranged like this, whether in a museum or memorial, underscores the collective trauma and the profound impact of the genocide on the fabric of Rwandan society. It's a testament to the human cost, a silent scream against the forces that drove such destruction. This political cartoon offers a powerful commentary. It juxtaposes the Nazi swastika with a mouse wearing a Jude hat, nailed to a cross, surrounded by money. The caption "Vuelto Judío," back to being Jewish, adds layers of historical reference and critique. It powerfully illustrates how dehumanized metaphors and stereotypes, linking groups to vermin or pests, have been used throughout history to justify persecution and violence. It connects the specific horror of Rwanda to broader patterns of hatred, reminding us that the tools of propaganda and dehumanization are tragically versatile and enduring. So, we've seen how the brain's tendency to blur literal and metaphorical, and its capacity for symbolic disgust, can be weaponized for hate. But, as the author suggests, this double-edged sword can also be turned. The same mechanisms that allow propagandists to dehumanize can potentially be harnessed by peacemakers. Let's consider the concept of sacred values explored by Atron, Axelrod, and Davis. Think about Green's description of conflicting cultures fighting over a commons, each with deeply held moral beliefs that seem incomprehensible to the other. Sacred values are like that. They're principles or objects that define a group's identity, defended far beyond what rational calculation would suggest. Why? because compromising on these values feels like dishonoring oneself, betraying one's core identity. Trying to buy someone off on a sacred value is often deeply insulting and counterproductive. You simply can't pay someone to renounce what they hold sacred. How does this play out in complex conflicts like the Middle East? If we were dealing purely with rational actors, peace between Israel and Palestine might hinge on concrete issues: border lines, reparations for land lost in 1948, water rights, security arrangements. Solving these nuts and bolts problems might end war, but true peace requires more. It demands acknowledging and respecting the sacred values of both sides. Atran and colleagues found this holds true across the spectrum. They interviewed Hamas leader Ghazi Hamad, who, besides demanding reparations, insisted Israel must formally apologize for the 1948 tragedy. Similarly, Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, when discussing peace requirements, cited not just security concerns, but also the need for Palestinians to change their textbooks and anti-Semitic characterizations. From a purely rational standpoint, an apology or textbook revision shouldn't matter much compared to land or borders. Yet, they do. Because acknowledging these symbolic concessions implicitly recognizes the other side's humanity, their capacity for pain, their unity, and their connection to their past. It's about validating their narrative. Look at the Jordan-Israel peace treaty signed in 1994. It addressed practical issues like water rights and counter-terrorism, creating a framework for coexistence. But true peace, a deeper reconciliation, seemed to crystallize later after the assassination of Israeli PM Yitzhak Rabin, a key architect of the Oslo Accords. King Hussein of Jordan made a stunning gesture. He attended Rabin's funeral and delivered a eulogy. He addressed Rabin's widow directly, calling him a brother, a colleague, and a friend. Now, objectively, this act didn't solve any of the material disputes. It didn't magically fix water rights or security concerns. Yet it was profoundly important. It was a symbolic concession, a recognition of shared loss and respect for the deceased leader, transcending political differences and building a foundation of trust that purely rational agreements couldn't achieve. A similar arc unfolded in Northern Ireland. The Good Friday Agreement of 1998 brought an end to decades of violence, establishing a power-sharing government between former enemies, Unionists and Republicans. The agreement tackled practical issues, like setting up a parades commission to manage inflammatory marches. But perhaps the most iconic symbol of lasting peace came from an unexpected source: the handshake between Peter Robinson, a fiery Unionist leader, and Martin McGuinness, a former IRA commander. These two men embodied the deepest divisions of the Troubles. They had a working relationship, but famously refused to shake hands for years. What finally broke the ice? A personal scandal involving Robinson's wife. McGuinness, showing remarkable restraint and perhaps a sense of shared human frailty, offered a commiserative handshake. Robinson accepted. The author calls this a Guy Code sacred value moment, a deeply personal, almost primal gesture of mutual respect that transcended politics and hatred. South Africa provides another powerful example, largely shaped by Nelson Mandela's genius for understanding and respecting sacred values. While imprisoned on Robben Island, Mandela immersed himself in Afrikaans language and culture, not just to understand his captors, but to understand the people themselves. This knowledge proved invaluable. Before the first free elections, Mandela secretly negotiated with General Constant Viljoen, leader of the Afrikaner Volksfront and commander of a large armed militia opposed to apartheid. Viljoen could have scuttled the transition and triggered civil war. Mandela met him informally, spoke to him warmly in Afrikaans, shared tea and snacks, chatted about sports. This act of profound respect, acknowledging Viljoen's world and culture, stunned the general. Though Viljoen didn't become Mandela's soulmate, Mandela's approach convinced him to call off his insurrection and run for office instead. Later, Viljoen praised Mandela in Xhosa, Mandela's native tongue. Mandela also famously embraced symbols sacred to the opposing side, like publicly supporting the Springboks rugby team, historically despised by black South Africans. The 1995 World Cup anthem, blending the ANC hymn with the Afrikaans anthem, was another monumental act of symbolic respect, uniting the nation. So what do figures like Hussein, McGuinness, Robinson, Viljoen, and Mandela show us? They demonstrate that our brain's peculiar ability to confuse the literal and the metaphorical, its capacity to grant life-threatening sanctity to the symbolic, can be wielded for positive ends. It allows us to build bridges where walls seemed insurmountable. This exploration of how symbolic acts can foster peace naturally leads us to consider the flip side. How biological factors, including potential neurological influences, intersect with our legal systems, particularly concerning criminal behavior and the age-old question of free will. This brings us to the next chapter's territory. Chapter 16 dives headfirst into the murky waters where neuroscience meets the criminal justice system. The author kicks things off with a provocative idea he once pitched. Should the criminal justice system be abolished? Based on neuroscience, he argued yes. His intention wasn't necessarily to advocate abolition, but to spark a conversation. This led to a conference bringing neuroscientists and legal experts together. It was eye-opening, revealing huge differences in how both fields use terms like possible or probable, and highlighting the gap between scientific understanding and courtroom practice. Despite the buzz around neurolaw, the author argues that the current system needs more than just tweaks. It needs a fundamental overhaul, rooted in a different understanding of human agency. Now, before we go there, let's acknowledge some really important ongoing debates within the legal system that involve science. Things like implicit biases in juries, whether neuroimages should be admissible evidence, the reliability of lie detection tech, setting IQ thresholds for execution eligibility, how scientific findings about mental illness affect jury perceptions, the ethical implications of pre-crime prediction, even whether a hungry judge should rule differently. These are all critical issues. The author admits they likely need reform, probably leaning towards a standard liberal agenda focused on civil liberties and rigorous scientific standards. However, this chapter isn't going that route. It aims for something more radical, moving beyond these incremental adjustments. To illustrate why incremental reforms might be insufficient, the author uses a powerful historical analogy: the witchcraft trials of 15th and 16th century Europe. Society was gripped by fear, and authorities devised tests to identify witches. There was the flotation test: if you float, you're a witch because you rejected baptism. The devil's spot test: inflict pain. If a spot doesn't hurt, it's where the devil entered. And the tear test: tell the story of Christ's crucifixion. If you don't cry, you're a witch. Then came Johann Weyer, a physician who wrote advocating for reform. He acknowledged witches existed, but criticized the flawed tests. His key point: elderly women especially might lack tear duct function due to age, risking false convictions based solely on their inability to cry. That's a liberal reform, right? Improving a tiny corner of a fundamentally irrational system. The author argues that applying neuroscience to our current justice system is often like Weyer's tear test, a superficial fix that doesn't address the deeper, more problematic assumptions. So, let's get down to brass tacks regarding biology and behavior. There are basically three ways people view this relationship. First, complete free will. We consciously control everything we do. Almost no one believes this anymore. Imagine convicting someone for assault during a seizure. Absurd. Second, no free will. Biology completely determines everything, and we have no conscious control. Fewer people hold this view either. Third, and this is the dominant perspective, mitigated free will. This is the idea that we have something like a spirit or soul that embodies our free will and intent, and this coexists with biology. However, biology can sometimes constrain or overwhelm this free will. Think of it as a well-intentioned spirit thwarted by weak flesh. This isn't strict philosophical compatibilism, but rather a dualistic view where intent exists alongside biological processes. The legal system has grappled with this mitigated free will concept for centuries. Consider the case of Daniel Manhattan in 1842. He tried to assassinate the British Prime Minister, but killed his secretary instead. He claimed paranoid voices compelled him, driven by persecution. His defense argued he was insane. The jury agreed, finding him not guilty by reason of insanity. This sparked massive public outcry. People felt a murderer had escaped justice. But the Supreme Court upheld the verdict, establishing the Manhattan Rule. You're not responsible if you couldn't distinguish right from wrong due to a mental defect. This rule was central to the Hinckley case, Reagan's attempted assassin. It caused outrage, leading to reforms limiting the insanity defense. Yet, the underlying principle persists. Severe mental illness can significantly diminish responsibility, reflecting a diminished capacity for rational choice, a core aspect of mitigated free will. How can we visualize this mitigated free will? The author offers a rather vivid, almost cartoonish picture. Imagine the brain as this incredibly complex machine: neurons, genes, neurotransmitters, all interacting according to physical laws. Inside this machine, tucked away in a bunker, sits a little person, a homunculus. This isn't a squishy biological entity. It's made of something else, maybe nanochips, old parchment, gumption, whatever. This homunculus is the seat of consciousness, intent, and free will. It controls behavior, makes decisions, takes information from the brain into account, but operates somewhat independently of the purely material processes. Of course, there are limits. Seizures, alcohol, serious injury can knock out the homunculus, temporarily overriding its control. Sometimes, the brain handles routine stuff automatically, letting the homunculus briefly take the wheel, like taking a deep breath before singing. But generally, the homunculus is making the calls. Now you might hear critics object, that's a ridiculous straw man, nobody believes in such a simplistic homunculus. True, most people don't frame it quite so literally. But the author argues the frequency or significance of free will doesn't matter. Even if you believe 99.99% of your actions are biologically determined, and you only exercise free will once a decade when deciding which way to floss, you've still implicitly invoked a homunculus operating outside the deterministic rules of science. It's the principle that matters. Most people who accept both biology and free will end up defining the scope and power of this putative homunculus. The debates then revolve around what this homunculus can and cannot do. So, where do these debates about the homunculus's capabilities arise? One major area is age and maturity. The Supreme Court rulings like Roper v. Simmons banning the death penalty for juvenile offenders are grounded in neuroscience showing the adolescent brain, particularly the frontal cortex responsible for impulse control and rational decision-making, is still developing. It's like the piglets versus the pig example. The younger ones aren't fully culpable. Related rulings have banned life without parole for juveniles, emphasizing their potential for reform. But this sparks debates. Does average developmental delay mean every single teenager lacks adult culpability? Is there a magic switch that flips on an 18th birthday? Critics argue the law already uses arbitrary age cutoffs for voting or drinking. Dissenting judges like O'Connor and Scalia pushed back, arguing maturity for murder isn't just about practical skills. Yet, everyone agrees there are age-related boundaries to responsibility. The homunculus takes time to mature. Another key debate is the nature and extent of brain damage. There's broad agreement that if someone has massive brain damage, like their entire frontal cortex wiped out, they likely can't be held responsible for criminal acts because their capacity for rational control is grossly impaired. Even critics like Stephen Morse concede this. But where do you draw the line? 99% damage. 98%. This is crucial because many death row inmates have histories of significant frontal lobe damage. Furthermore, there's the question of responsibility levels. Neuroscientist Michael Gazzaniga famously says, "Free will is an illusion, but you're still responsible." He argues responsibility exists at a social level, not a brain level. Finally, there's the timing of decisions. The homunculus seems to be firmly in control during slow, deliberate choices, but in split-second reactions, biological reflexes might take over. This connects back to the adolescent brain debate. Frontal lobe immaturity impacts impulsive reactions more than it does careful, considered moral reasoning. A further distinction is between causation and compulsion. Every action has a cause, that's causation. But compulsion refers to situations where the cause is so overwhelming it bypasses rational deliberation. Think about schizophrenia delusions. If someone hears a voice suggesting a crime, courts might say you should resist, just like you'd resist a suggestion from a friend. But if the voice is incessant, thunderous, commanding, and utterly overwhelming, making resistance impossible, that's seen as compulsion, potentially excusing the act. Then there's the famous Libet experiment. Subjects reported feeling they decided to move their wrist, but brain signals showed preparation started half a second earlier. Does this mean free will is an illusion? Critics argue the delay is an artifact of the experiment. Libet himself proposed free won't. Maybe we don't choose to start the action, but we can veto it in that brief window before it happens. This whole debate, the author suggests, is about the homunculus's control panel. How much control does it have over initiating versus stopping an action? This brings us to a fascinating psychological study by Carol Dweck. She found that praising kids for being smart versus working hard has vastly different effects. Praising effort leads to more persistence, resilience, and enjoyment of learning. Praising intelligence makes kids less willing to try hard, fear challenges, and focus solely on grades. Why? Because we intuitively sort things into two buckets: aptitude and impulse, which feel biological, and effort and resisting impulse, which feel like free will. We readily grasp the material basis for natural talent, the perfect muscle fibers for a vaulter, the ideal vocal cords for a singer. But when we see someone overcome incredible odds, like Wilma Rudolph did after polio, it feels less like biology and more like sheer grit, the work ethic of that little homunculus pushing through pain and temptation. It's easier to explain talent materially than perseverance spiritually. This dualistic thinking is starkly illustrated in the case of Jerry Sandusky. An opinion piece by James Cantor reviewed the neurobiology of pedophilia, noting genetic links, childhood injuries, hormonal abnormalities, and concluded, one cannot choose to not be a pedophile. Fair enough, acknowledging biology. But then Cantor makes a leap. But one can choose to not be a child molester. Suddenly, the same brain is split. The biology creates the impulse, but the person can choose to resist the act. The table shown reinforces this. Destructive impulses, hallucinations, susceptibility to alcohol are listed alongside resisting them. The author argues this is flawed. Being a child molester isn't just about resisting an impulse. The underlying biological predispositions likely influence the act itself. Drawing such a sharp line between the cause and the action, assigning the former to biology and the latter to free will, is a remnant of folk psychology, not a nuanced understanding of the brain. Enter Stephen Morse, a prominent critic of bringing neuroscience into the courtroom. He firmly believes free will is compatible with a deterministic world. He accepts the Manhattan Rule and acknowledges that severe brain damage can excuse criminal acts. But beyond those extreme cases, he thinks neuroscience offers little that challenges personal responsibility. His famous quip, brains don't kill people. People kill people. He's highly skeptical of the neurolaw movement, calling it brain overclaim syndrome, where enthusiasm for neuroscience leads people to make legal claims the science doesn't actually support. He argues neuroscience often just redescribes behavior in neural terms, without refuting free will, unlike past waves of psychological or genetic determinism. He raises valid points, like the risk of juries being swayed by impressive brain scans, and the difference between correlation and causation in neuroscience findings. Morse tries to distinguish between general causation and specific compulsion as excuses. But the author finds this distinction problematic. How can you draw a line between a cause that excuses and one that doesn't without implicitly bringing back that homunculus idea? You need a rational agent, capable of handling normal causation, but susceptible to being overwhelmed by compulsion. As philosopher Sean Nichols points out, it seems we have to choose, either commit to free will or commit to the idea that everything is caused by preceding events. Holding both tightly feels contradictory. Ultimately, Morse concludes that neuroscience's impact on law is modest. The final hypothetical exchange drives this home. The prosecutor asks the neuroscientist testifying for the defense, "Okay, you've shown the defendant had frontal lobe damage. But hasn't every person with that kind of damage become a multiple murderer?" The neuroscientist has to answer no, and that's the crux of it. If the presence of a certain brain abnormality doesn't reliably predict criminal behavior in the general population, how can you use that general finding to argue away responsibility for this specific individual? The link between the science and the legal judgment remains weak. Neuroscience describes correlations and mechanisms, but proving diminished responsibility for a unique individual in a specific context is still incredibly challenging. So wrapping up this section, we've journeyed from the dark side of metaphorical thinking enabling genocide to the bright side where symbolic respect fosters peace. We've seen how the concept of mitigated free will attempts to bridge the gap between biology and agency, but we've also seen how applying it in the legal realm, especially concerning criminal responsibility, hits major roadblocks. Neuroscience gives us fascinating insights into the workings of the mind, but whether it provides the revolutionary tools needed to overhaul our justice system remains a deeply contested and unresolved question.